4,572 CKs out there yet. Hear the word of the Lord. Then Jesus and his disciples and the crowds came to Jericho. And as Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, that is the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." So they called to the blind man, "Cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you." Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asked him. The blind man said, "Rabbi, I want to see." "Go," said Jesus. "Your faith has healed you." Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road. This is the word of the Lord. So this story, what's interesting is, we're preaching through the book of Mark at our church, and I was thinking to myself, I feel like this story is so planted in the overall story of the book of Mark that I figured I would take a few minutes here just to sort of orient us to the book of Mark and where this story arrives, because it's pivotal. Essentially, Mark is broken up into what I would call 3 acts. Act 1 would be Mark chapter 1 through about halfway through chapter 8. And in Act 1, Jesus is arriving on the scene. He is baptized, and then he goes to a synagogue, and he casts out a demon, and he calls his disciples to himself. And then he begins this ministry where he is healing people and casting out demons, and he's teaching with authority, and the scribes and the teachers of the law are perplexed by this man. The crowds are following him because they want to be healed by him. He's touching people who should make him unclean, and yet he's making them clean and healing them of their diseases. And he's doing all these really wonderful things. And people are asking themselves, who is this guy? I mean, really? The teachers of the law are perplexed by him because he's turning them upside down and inside out in what they're trying to say to him. And then we get this story about halfway through chapter 8. And it's actually a story of a blind man being healed. And it's pointing forward to Act 2 of the book of Mark, which is about halfway through chapter 8 through chapter 10. Our story is actually the very last story in Act 2. In Act 2 of chapter 8, Jesus is teaching how to be a true disciple. And so this first story of the blind man, Jesus takes him aside, away from the town and off out by himself, and he heals him, and he does it in stages. So first he spits on his eyes, then he places his hands over his eyes, and then he asks him, what can you see? He says, I see people walking around. They look like trees. And so it gives you the impression that his sight was only partially healed. And so then Jesus places his hands over his eyes again, and then asks him when he can see, and then he can see clearly. And so he heals the man in stages, and this is almost like a parable pointing forward to Act 2 of the book of Mark. And in Act 2, he's teaching them what it is to be a true disciple. And because of that story at the beginning, we realize that what's happening in Act 2 is that people are coming to understand who Jesus is in stages. Right? No one really fully grasps the significance of this man and what it means to truly be a disciple of Jesus. In fact, the next story, back in chapter 8, after the healing of the blind man, kind of ties together Act 1 and Act 2. And that's when Jesus asks his disciples, well, who do you say that I am? And Peter has this great moment where he says, you are the Christ. And Jesus is like, yes! And if you want to be my disciple, you have to pick up your cross and you have to follow after me. And so we realize the disciples' understanding of who Jesus is different, right? So they understand that he's the Christ. They're partially able to see, but they don't understand the significance of what it means to be a disciple. And so I'm going to kind of do just a quick overview of Acts 2 and some of the things we learn about what it means to be a true disciple. So a true disciple takes up their cross and follows Jesus. A true disciple, like Moses and Elijah, who appeared to Jesus in Peter, James, and John on the Mount of Transfiguration. A true disciple chooses suffering over glory, which is what we learn from that story. A true disciple relies on Jesus through prayer for the power to serve him and even the power to believe in him, right? Which is the story of the man who says, I believe, but help me with my unbelief. A true disciple is last and servant of all. A true disciple takes radical measures to eliminate sin from their life. Jesus says, you must cut off your hand or gouge out your eye if that's what it takes to eliminate sin from your life. A true disciple doesn't look for loopholes to get out of their marriages and their covenant commitments and responsibilities, which is the beginning of chapter 10. We learn about what it is to, Jesus' teaching of divorce and marriage. A true disciple accepts the kingdom of God as a gift like a child. A true disciple does not attempt to earn the kingdom, but gives up anything that might be in the way of their being able to receive it. And that's the story of the rich young ruler, right? He's holding on to his wealth, but he has to let go of his wealth in order to receive, like a child, the free gift of the kingdom. A true disciple does not attempt to earn the kingdom. I just read that. And a true disciple sees true greatness as being a slave of all. And that was the story right before the story of the blind man and Bartimaeus. And that's when James and John come up to Jesus and they say to him, hey, when we get into your kingdom, we'd like to sit on your right hand and your left hand in the kingdom. And Jesus is like, okay, I don't think you guys quite understand. And then he says, for even the Son of Man did not come to serve, or to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for me. And then we get the story of blind Bartimaeus. So Act 2 ends with this passage, and it points backwards to everything that we just learned in Act 2, but it also points forward into Act 3, where Jesus enters into Jerusalem. He's no longer hiding his identity as the Messiah and the Son of David, and he's on his way to the cross. So this is a very pivotal story in the book of Mark. So here's our outline this morning. Point number 1 is going to be a true disciple knows their misery. Point number 2, a true disciple knows the remedy. And then the final point this morning will be a true disciple follows joyfully. So point number 1, true disciple knows their misery. So ever since the beginning of Act 2, as I'm calling it, we've had example after example, especially with the disciples, people who seem to be unaware of their true condition before God and what it means to truly be a disciple. Now, the disciples can sort of be forgiven for this in some ways, right? Because their expectation of what it meant for the Messiah to come was that he was going to resurrect the kingdom. They were going to go back to the glory that Israel had under Solomon and King David. These Romans who were oppressing them were going to be thrown out by the Messiah, and he was going to set up his kingdom, right? This is why James and John asked to sit at his right hand and his left hand in his kingdom, because that's their expectation, right? But they didn't realize that the real issue was not the Roman oppression, but the oppression of sin. They didn't realize the depth of their sinfulness. They didn't realize the desperate need that they had for forgiveness and for transformation. That unless they took their sin seriously and made every effort to eliminate it from their lives, that they would end up in hell. They thought that the fact that they left everything and followed Jesus somehow earned for them a place in this kingdom. They didn't realize that there's nothing that anyone can do to earn a place in Jesus' kingdom. It must be received as a gift, like a little child, which is what we learned at the beginning of chapter 10. But this blind man, this Bartimaeus, he knows his misery. He knows it. Because he's blind. In that culture, if you were blind, you were a sinner. So he's an outcast. He cannot even enter the temple because if you were blind or lame in the first century, it meant that you were defective. It meant that you were impure physically, but it also meant that you were impure and defective spiritually. He couldn't even approach God. Can you imagine being told your entire life that you are such a huge sinner that you can't even approach God? That God has got such a weight of judgment on you because of your sin. There's nothing you can do. So his physical deformity was an outward sign to him and to everyone else of his spiritual deformity, because God is too holy for someone so broken and so sinful to come near. Bartimaeus knew Leviticus chapter 21, verse 18, which says, "For no one who has a blemish shall draw near. A man blind or lame, or one who has a mutilated face or a limb too long." There's a story in John chapter 9. Jesus is going along with his disciples, and they come across a man born blind. The disciples ask Jesus, "Hey, Jesus, who sinned? This man or his parents that he was born blind?" And this is Jesus' response. He says, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him." So Jesus says, "Hey, this man didn't sin. Actually, I had a purpose for his blindness, so that the works of God might be displayed." But I bring up that story not to necessarily point out Jesus' response, but to point out the assumption the disciples had. They thought, surely this man or his parents must have sinned in order for him to have been born blind. That was the assumption in that culture at that time. And so that was the assumption that Bartimaeus had of himself. He felt like he deserved everything that he was experiencing. This is also why no one felt bad shunning the blind or the lame, because they figured, hey, that person deserves to be an outcast. So for a blind man at that time to ask for healing, he wasn't just asking to see. He was asking to become a whole person. He was asking to be forgiven. He was asking to be transformed. He was asking for mercy, for grace, for kindness. He was asking to be welcomed into society, into fellowship. He was asking to no longer be on the outside looking in, like maybe many of you feel this morning. Maybe you can identify with being outside of a social circle and just feeling ostracized and left out. He was the complete opposite of the rich young ruler who had no money, he had no possessions, and he was fully aware that he had not kept the commandments from his youth. He felt like he even deserved the blindness that he had. And so at the end of our story, when Jesus says to him, what do you want me to do for you? The moment that God looks at you and says, what do you want me to do for you? That is the moment that your heart is exposed. Because then you think, oh yeah, I really want fill in the blank. Because this is the exact question that Jesus had just asked James and John, right? When they came up to him and they said, hey, grant that, they asked him, hey, we want to ask you a question. And Jesus said, well, what do you want me to do for you? And their answer, they said to him, grant us to sit one on your right hand and one on your left in glory. So James and John, they want glory. They want power. They want prestige. They wanted to be on the inner circle with the Messiah, which means at the end of the day, they didn't see themselves as desperate, deformed sinners separated from the holy God because of their sin. At the end of the day, they thought power would save them. What would you say to Jesus if he asked you, what do you want me to do for you? Think about that. Well, whatever comes to your mind, that's what you think is causing your misery. If that thing were somehow different, then you'd be okay. But what does Bartimaeus say? He says, Rabbi, let me recover my sight. And remember, he's not just asking to see, he's asking to be forgiven. He's asking to be accepted. So have you ever been so aware of your blindness and lameness and sin and suffering that all you wanted in the world was to be made whole? Are you now, or have you ever been so sick of your misery before God that it didn't matter to you if you ever sat at the right hand of glory? All you wanted was the healing touch of God. Are you now, or have you ever been in a place where the weight of what you are, right, not just what we've done, and the Bible says that we were conceived in sin. So somehow the weight of what we are as a sinner born that way has to land on us. Has that been such a crushing weight on you that you can think of nothing else about what it would be like for God to heal you and to make you whole? You see, a true disciple knows this. A true disciple sees that not only their sin, but also their suffering, their misery, is so infinite that only an infinite God can come and make them whole. So have you ever been in that place? Have you ever been in the place where you are undone by the holiness of God? Where you are undone by your own sinfulness? And where all you want to do is say to God, save me, and don't give me over to my sin. Let me not wander from your commandments, which is what the psalmist says. I think there are probably some in this room this morning who have never come to that place. And at the end of the day, maybe you think that you're a pretty good chap. And when you look into the cauldron of your soul, everything seems pretty okay. Sure, you're a sinner, but hey, God's forgiven you. You're not aware of any sin in your life that you actually have to cut off your hand or gouge out your eye in order to stop committing. Maybe you're like the rich young ruler. For the most part, you're satisfied that you've kept the commandments. You're not aware of anything that is separating you from God. And maybe it's because when you compare yourself to others, you compare yourself to others and to the society or others in the church instead of what the Word of God says. There are also some in this room who have never come to a place like that because maybe you love your sin too much. You love movies and TV shows that glorify sex and violence. And maybe there's some in this room where you feel like you are crying out to God to heal you. And there's no answer. I don't know necessarily why that would be. But I know that Jesus heals, as we will see. Which takes us to point number 2. True disciple knows the remedy. So somehow, Bartimaeus is sitting there outside of Jericho, begging, and the news of who this Jesus is trickles down to him. All right? He hears about this man from Nazareth who's healing people, he's casting out demons, he's doing signs and wonders, he's teaching with authority. And I think that he thought to himself, if this Jesus ever comes here, he's going to notice me. In the book of Matthew, we get this story of John the Baptist, and he's put in prison, and he's starting to doubt his ministry and his life. And so he sends his disciples to Jesus, and he says, hey, go to Jesus and ask him if he is the one or if we should look for another. And this is what we read there. It says, Now when John heard in prison about the deeds of the Christ, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another? And then Jesus answered them. He said, Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them. And why does Jesus answer John's disciples this way? Why doesn't he say to them, Yes, I'm the one. Go tell John that I'm pleased with him. There's nothing to worry about. He has served me faithfully and well. But instead he said, Go and tell them what you see and what you hear. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk. The lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear. Jesus does this because that's what the Old Testament says, right? Jesus is answering his question in Old Testament categories that would have been plain to John. Right? Just like they're plain to Bartimaeus. When Bartimaeus hears about this man, right? And the lame are walking, and the blind are receiving their sight. Bartimaeus is thinking of passages like this in Isaiah. This is the Messiah speaking in Isaiah. It says, And I will lead the blind in a way that they do not know, and paths that they have not known. I will guide them. I will turn the darkness before them into light, the rough places into level ground. These are the things I do, and I do not forsake them. And so Bartimaeus is sitting there. I bet you he heard that verse one time, and he memorized it. And he thought, Oh, the Messiah. He can heal me. He can heal me. I can't go into the temple. I can't approach God because I'm too much of a sinner, but there's this Messiah who's coming. And when he comes, he's going to make me able to see. He's going to make it where the rough places become smooth and I'm not going to stumble everywhere I go. My sins will be forgiven. Bartimaeus knew who this Messiah was, too. He knew. Isaiah 11:1, which says, There shall come forth from a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and the branch from his roots shall bear fruit. The stump of Jesse, see, Jesse was King David's father. Right? This branch would come from King David. This is who the Messiah would be. He would be the son of David. Jeremiah says, Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he shall reign as king and deal wisely, and shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. So these stories circulated all to Jericho about this Jesus of Nazareth, who is healing the blind. He's the son of David. This is what Bartimaeus says. He knows, right? God opens up his eyes of faith, and he knows that this Jesus is the one. And then one day, Bartimaeus is sitting in his usual spot outside the city. A large crowd comes pouring forth. And when he heard, he's sitting there. This large crowd comes pouring forth. And he hears that it was Jesus of Nazareth. He began to cry out and say, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. He cried out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. So he's sitting there, right? He's like, what's going on? Who are all these people? Somebody says, shut up, Bartimaeus. It's Jesus. Well, Jesus was like one of the most popular names back then. Jesus who? Jesus of Nazareth. It's Jesus of Nazareth. He just starts screaming. I mean, I can picture him sitting there, Jesus! Right? He's screaming, Jesus, son of David! Have mercy on me! And people are like, shut up, Bartimaeus. Shh. He doesn't care. He keeps screaming, right? It says right there, many rebuked him, telling him to be silent, but he cried out all the more. He's just screaming. This was his one chance. This was his one opportunity to get Jesus' attention. He didn't care what anyone thought. He didn't care about social convention. You see, it's one thing to know that Jesus is the remedy. It's another thing to cry out to Jesus to heal you. It's one thing to believe Jesus can save your soul. It's quite another to know that your soul is destitute and must be saved, and that only Jesus can, and the one question that haunts you is will. I imagine this room is filled with those who know their sin and know their struggles. There's some here who are depressed. Some are sad. Life is much harder than you imagined it would be, and you're anxious. I don't know how you handle that. Maybe you drink to excess. Maybe you're caught up in a sin and you're ashamed of it. You hate it, but it seems to be the thing that you find yourself turning to, even though you told yourself you wouldn't. Or there's some here who handle it by being self-righteous. Maybe you hardly know what to ask forgiveness for, even if you had the opportunity. This passage tells us don't be silent anymore. If you can truly hear this morning, Jesus is passing through. I think sometimes we think there's a tomorrow. We think we can let go of that sin tomorrow. Bartimaeus had one chance. Jesus walked through Jericho one time. Jesus may never walk by again. We might sit in the pews for 25 more years and never be more willing to cry out to Jesus than we are today. Maybe you're afraid of the crowd rebuking you if you cry out. Who cares about the crowd? Maybe you're afraid of what it would be like to admit that you hardly think that you're a sinner. Who cares? The Bible says you are. Admit it. And then God will open your eyes to your sin, and when He does, when we look to the cross and we see Jesus, we know grace upon grace. Notice also Bartimaeus calls Jesus the Son of David. See, we don't have to just know that we need to cry out to Jesus. We need to know the Jesus that we cry out to. You know what I mean? Mormons cry out to Jesus, but that's not the right Jesus. Jehovah's Witnesses cry out to Jesus, but they don't know the right Jesus. We have to know the Jesus of the Bible. He's the Son of David. This is the only time in the book of Mark Jesus is called by that name, and it's unmistakably loaded. The entire book of Mark, Jesus has been hushing people, telling them not to tell anyone who He is. But here in his final miracle before He goes to the cross, He accepts this title from a blind, unself-conscious beggar. And in the very next scene, He's going to ride into Jerusalem on a donkey. He's going to accept the crowd, crying out, "Blessed is He who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David." So even though to accept this title publicly would be to threaten His own life, Jesus stops anyway and said, "Call him." They called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, He's calling to you." So if you see your misery this morning, and you want nothing else but to be free from it, and you know that Jesus is the remedy, and you are willing to cry out to Him, regardless of what others might think, then you are ready to be a true disciple. And to you I say, take heart, get up, He's calling. And He was willing to die, to stop and turn to you, and call you to Him, because He loves you that much. Which takes us to our final point. A true disciple follows joyfully. Verse 15. And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Now his cloak would have been his only possession. Likely it was sitting on his lap, or it was full of the coins that people had given to him. Right? He would have used it at night to keep warm, but when Jesus calls to him, he springs up. I can picture the coins flying everywhere. Right? He can't see, so he doesn't know where he's going, so he starts walking in this direction. People literally have to grab him and pull him. No, Jesus is over here. He's being pulled by the crowd until he finally gets in front of Jesus. You see, the beauty of knowing your true spiritual condition before God, the beauty of knowing your misery, is that it is easy to leave everything and come to Jesus. See, some of you here this morning, some of us, if we're honest, we are more like the rich young ruler. There are some things that we're not willing to let go of in order to spring up and come to Jesus. It's so much easier to acknowledge that you believe in him and just hope that's enough and carry on. Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "Rabbi, let me recover my sight." Jesus said to him, "Go your way, your faith has made you well," and immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way. A true disciple who has come to Jesus in humility and repentance. A true disciple is one who knows their misery, knows that Jesus is the remedy, and will jump at the chance to come to Jesus and find healing and wholeness and forgiveness and the power to be transformed into a new creation. A true disciple has faith that makes healing possible. A true disciple will immediately, upon their eyes being opened, follow Jesus on the way. It doesn't matter to Bartimaeus that he's just outed Jesus as the Messiah, which is going to ultimately lead to Jesus' death. It doesn't matter to him that following him along the way means following him to the cross and to his own humiliation, suffering, and death. At the beginning of Act 2, Jesus told his disciples, "You must take up your cross and follow me." Here Bartimaeus does this willingly. He doesn't care. The funny thing is here the disciples still don't get it. You know when they get it? They get it when Jesus is raised from the dead. Right? And for us, if we don't get it, the solution is to look at Jesus on the cross. He suffered and died willingly. He endured being separated from God the Father for the first time in all of eternity. Our sin is that terrible that it required that. But his mercy and his grace is that infinite that he was willing to do that. See, the Christian life is staring at that reality and staring at it and staring at it and staring at it until we realize that our sin necessitated that if we were to be saved. And then to cry out in repentance and plead with Jesus for his mercy. And that he would please heal you. But then it's realizing that he did it because he loved you personally. That's how infinite his grace is. That's how amazing it is. To be captured by that. And then to realize that if you're crying out to him for your suffering on this side of heaven, and then he doesn't seem to be answering you, that the one thing that you truly need, he has given, which is the forgiveness of your sins. I was encouraged to hear many people this morning say that's what they were thinking. Because that's the one thing that can never be taken. Let's pray. Father, we come to you this morning. We see Bartimaeus. He knows his misery. He knows the remedy. And he follows you joyfully. Father, I pray that you would open our eyes if we don't see it to know the depth of our misery. Because it's only in knowing the depth of our misery that we can truly appreciate the remedy. And it's only in appreciating the remedy which we will be given the strength and the courage to follow joyfully, God, and to persevere in this life through all the trials and struggles. It's only in knowing what you've done for us that we'll be willing to live a life of joyful and grateful obedience and to risk being mocked by the crowds so that we can tell everyone who you are. God, I pray for all those here this morning who don't maybe know this, who are maybe on the inside scratching their head, thinking, I don't know Jesus in this way. I pray, God, that you would move powerfully and open their hearts and minds. And then, Lord, I pray that you would encourage those who know this, who have in their heart of hearts cried out to you like this. And this story resonates with them because it encourages them, because they know that they know you in the same way that this man over 2,000 years ago came to know you. We pray this all in your Son's holy name. Amen. Our parting blessing comes from the book of 1 Thessalonians, verse 23 of chapter 5. Now may the God of peace himself sanctify you completely. May your whole... Oh, stand. Sorry. Let me start over. Now may the God of peace himself sanctify you completely. And may your whole spirit and soul and body be kept blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. He who calls you is faithful. He will surely do it. And all God's people said, Amen. Invite the band.